Hey everyone, what does it mean to die with dignity? If we're near the end of our life, what choices do we have, or what choices should we have? What are your views on death and dying? In most Western states, we have a very different approach and belief about death than they do in Eastern cultures. We're going to be talking about that and much, much more today. In today's Reawaken You, check how you are on kindness this week and being conscious of others. I was doing yard work yesterday and can barely move my arms today, but when we went behind our fence to trim trees, we were amazed at the amount of trash that was in our backyard, not from us. I back up, we have a bunch of trees, and we back up to a busy road, but, you know, litter is just inconsiderate. And I think not only of litter, like why would you just walk down the street and throw something in someone else's yard, but when you're driving and people cut you off because they're not aware, it's all about me, me, me. You know, as we're moving towards our new earth, it's about the we community. And I just think we'd be so much better off if we were to be more kind and be more aware of others. So just check in with yourself this week and see if there are places where you can be more kind and more conscious of everyone around you. Okay, we're going to tell you about today's guest. While being an advocate for reclaiming our human rights and dignity, Donna Corso is also an advocate for planet Earth. Her passion for the environment was ignited in 1988 when she attended her first WindStar Symposium in Aspen. She also trained as a facilitator of the Awakening the Dreamer, Changing the Dream Symposium, a multimedia interactive presentation designed to foster an environmentally sustainable, spiritually fulfilling, socially just world. Donna encourages everyone to become aware of issues that impact our human rights, our health, and the health and integrity of our planet, and to become proactive in whatever direction their heart leads them. Since 2001, Donna has been personal assistant to Neil Donald Walsh, author of the Conversations with God series. Welcome, Donna.
Thank you, Julie. Good to be here.
I'm so excited. I'm going to hold up your book. This is called When the Wind Chimes Chime. Now, Donna was sent to me by Deborah Jacobs. Deborah's like, you'll love the book. I just like, okay. Deborah always sends me everyone, and I trust her. And I didn't know what this book was about. And I was so moved by it. And I told Donna before we started, I said, I'm giving this book as my birthday's in 2 weeks, and I'm giving it to someone to say, please read this as your birthday present to me to start a conversation. I think this book is so important and it is so great about opening up a dialogue. But let's first start with the first half of the book, which is, why don't you briefly summarize Andraez and his story?
All right. Well, thank you for that introduction, Julie. I appreciate that. Yes, Andraez was a 7-year-old boy when he died. He died of osteosarcoma, which is bone cancer. It was in his upper arm. And I felt that it was a story that really needed to be told. It was a tragic story, and yet I believe that on a soul level he came to have that story told. Andraez was diagnosed with osteosarcoma, and when his parents discovered that, of course, they took him to doctors, and the doctors did many, many x-rays over and over again. Finally, the doctors told them that they wanted to amputate his arm, part of his rib, part of his lungs, and give him chemo and radiation. Now, by the time that they made that diagnosis, Andraez was already dying because it had already been shown to be in other bone tissue, and it had spread beyond the point where he could actually be healed. That was very clear. There would not even be a 1% chance he could survive that. The reason they really knew that was because Andraez, his father, whose name is Gordy, had done total research, 24/7 research. He connected with about 300 other children, or the parents of the children, who had similar situations where their doctor told them that they were going to do all of these invasive treatments. And every single one of them died anyway, and they died a horrible death. So Gordy and his wife Joey decided they did not want that to happen to Andraez. They wanted something else, some alternative. And as soon as they said to the doctor, isn't there some alternative? The doctor said, if you try anything like that, we will take your son, we will make him ward of the state, we will do these treatments with or without your consent. They also threatened to take their other 2 children away from them and make them ward of the state as well. So I knew that people needed to know about this, the possibility that we might not have all the choices that we think that we should have if our child should be called terminally ill.
I had no idea until reading your book that this was even a possibility. Like, just didn't even enter into my mind that this could happen. And you know, you really go into detail about this, and I can't even imagine one having a child, having to see him suffer like that, but then to add insult to injury to the state, like, if you don't let us do it this way, we're going to take your child from you. Do you know, have laws changed since this happened to Andraez? Is this pretty much across the board in the U.S.? Do you have any information on that?
At the time when Gordy was doing his research, he said that there were only 4 states that would allow you to even incorporate alternative or complementary therapies along with those treatments. I don't know what the thing is now, but I know it's a state law that if your child is under 16, whatever the doctor says is the law, and you have to go along with it. And they could possibly make your child ward of the state. They can also incarcerate parents. Gordy did come across some parents who had been put in jail because they would not go along with the treatment, and their child was taken and made ward of the state, and the child died in the hospital without even having the parents with him because the parents were in jail. And I just find that a total disrespect for our human rights as parents. And you know, we want to care for our children. We want the best for them. And if we have to lose them, if it does come to the point where they are going to die, we at least want them to die in as peaceful a way as possible. And they were not able to do that because they had to be running from the law the last few months of his life. Which is just crazy if you think about it. And
I want to distinguish something, though. When you read the book, you go into detail. Gordy did an incredible amount of research on this. This was a very specific cancer. I mean, the facts were that Andraez wasn't going to make it. They took him to China to see ancient healers who were like, yes, you know, this is his path. And they really tried all angles. But you know, I also believe that if a parent, if there's something that can save a child and the parent doesn't take them, to me that's the same thing. Like, I would hope that a parent would do whatever they could to save their child. You know, I know there's some religions that don't believe in medical care. To me, there's a balance that you can balance. Absolutely. The right of the parents and the health of the child. And obviously you wouldn't want your child hacked literally a third of his body off. But I think the bigger issue here is, and I'll just speak for the U.S. or perhaps Western societies, is this fear of death. If we as a culture had accepted it more, then there would be like, okay, we're going to make Andraez as peaceful as possible. We are going to help him ease into this transition instead of fighting it tooth and nail. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, absolutely. I think especially a child, you know, if they have a limited time left, they should be able to do the things that children love to do while they still can. You know, go to Disney World, go to do things like that, and also to have time with the family for peaceful closure, not having to be running from the law. I love the story about when Gordy took Andraez to China, because they had a connection with a doctor over there who used Qigong and herbal Chinese herbs, but he was a medical doctor as well. And as you know from reading the book, Julie, they got Gordy and Andraez went to China, and these two old men from a 6,000-year lineage of Qigong masters actually came and got around Andraez along with the medical doctor, and they left in a few minutes, and Gordy said to the interpreter, well, can they save my son? What did they say? And the interpreter said, they have identified your son as one of the ancient ones, that this is his soul's way of leaving this planet, and neither your Western medicine that would actually mutilate him and give him chemicals, nor our Eastern techniques of Qigong. Nothing can make this soul stay. This is his way of leaving. And, you know, I really think that Andraez knew that he would be here for a short time, and that his life and his death possibly would awaken many people to the choices that we have, that this was his purpose.
And I think I love at the beginning of the book, you did the little soul story and prior kind of as how you envisioned it to Andraez coming and, you know, being born and meeting his family. And I think that's so important. I mean, I've learned personally, everything happens for a reason. And even if something is maybe a tragedy, there's always good that can come out of that. And even if it happens to me, I might not understand it now, but 5 or 10 years down the road, I mean, I personally think Andraez's legacy is going to be huge. You've written this book. I mean, there's so many people standing up for care for their children, having conversations about death and dying. I mean, there's so many offshoots of this that he'll have as a legacy.
Absolutely. I think so too. Yes, and I wrote that first part. I put it in the beginning of the book and the end of the book. I called it the soul plan. I personally believe that we come here more than one time. Some people don't believe that, so they might read that simply as a fairy tale or what if this were true. But I personally believe that we do design our life path before we come, and we remember it when we're on the other side. That's my belief system.
I believe that as well. Another thing that this book, I want to talk deeper about why you think in our society we fear death so much. I know people that I'm close to fear death, but when I lived in LA, to me, plastic surgery, I know this might sound kind of silly, but my view was plastic surgery, why it has increased so much and why people have done this is part of it is to stave off death. To be like, you know what, if I make myself look younger, then then I'm immortal, or that means I can push death further and further out. And I could be wrong about that, but that's my view on that, because it just seems part of the other things that we do to, we only value young people in our culture when old people have all this great wisdom to share. I mean, I think it's a whole cultural thing. What do you think about that?
Oh, I think so too. All of our fashion magazines show everyone young and beautiful and in perfect condition as though they are never going to grow old. And so we like to think that we are never going to grow old. And I can tell you, I still feel as young as I did when I was 20 or 30, and that was 30, almost 40 years ago. So, I can understand people wanting to stay youthful, but we do have to understand that death is a part of the natural life cycle. But, our media bombards us with pictures of death all the time. We can turn on the television at any moment of the day and see wars, see people being tortured or killed. We read the newspapers, people being murdered, and all of the atrocities that are going on. So that does tend to give us a fear of death, or not wanting to even say the word or think about it. We want to push it away, and as though it happens to other people and not ourselves. So that's why I feel that Andraez's story, the second half of the book, if we can understand that there are many people that are able to see the whole cycle of life and know that this is just a natural part, and it can be a beautiful part, I believe. In fact, when I was a kid, my parents used to take me to funerals, and I remember thinking, wow, this must be the most exciting part of life, because I believe that there's something even better after we die, after we leave these physical bodies. I don't believe we do die, by the way. I believe we simply leave the body and realize that we're still every bit as much alive as we were before, and it's beautiful. Although I think we do have to prepare for it in a way that we move into something beautiful. There can be other experiences of it, I suppose, but it's natural. We just need to really understand life, the whole cycle of it.
I agree with you. I think I was very close to my grandmother, and I lost a great aunt and Sybil, who was like a second mother to me. But what all the three of them did, they planned. They took care of it. I just admired that because because even though we're spiritual beings, we're still in a human body. Even though, if they were in pain, we were happy they're not in pain anymore. There's still sadness. There's still that grieving period. But because they had planned everything, it made it so much easier on everyone. Like, I've already decided the women, the guys can get off and wear what they want, but I want women wearing purple or leopard print at my funeral and enjoying themselves. That's going to be the request I make. But, I think that it helps to plan. So I'd like to talk a little bit more. First of all, is there anything else? We could really spend a whole hour on Andraez's story because it was so moving. Is there anything else before we move on that you would like to share about that?
I think you're covering it pretty well.
Okay. So what I really appreciated, again, because I was like, well, what's coming next? Because we finished the story here. You do such a good job of creating questions and things to think about for us to ask to start this conversation to get over the fear of death. So do you have anything you'd like to start off with?
Well, yes, because that was the focus of my book. I didn't want to just tell a sad story about a little boy who died. I wanted it to open our hearts as well as open our eyes. I wanted it to open our eyes about the possibilities. What if my child were terminally ill? What if I were terminally ill? What would I do? And that opens our hearts as well as helping people to understand that there may be laws that prevent us from having a peaceful death. But beyond that, I wanted to help people to not be afraid of death. And so I have a lot of stories in the second part about people I have known personally who had some of them had visions before they died and it comforted them. Some of them were able to plan their own celebration of life and they had it before they died. And, just many situations where people were able to really let go of that fear. There's always going to be, I'm sure if someone is given a prognosis that they're going to die, there's always going to be that shock. There's always going to be the 5 stages that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross had identified. We're going to deny that it's happening. We're going to be angry with God perhaps, or whatever. We're going to bargain with God and all of those stages. But eventually we can come to accept it, and then we can really be able to prepare for it and know that we're safe, we're loved, we're going to have a wonderful journey.
The guest that I had on last week composed a whole CD of music to listen to while transitioning. And what she has found, she felt guided. She's a poet and musician and felt guided to do this CD and ended up producing it and duplicating it because she got such great feedback that not only it helped the person who was transitioning, but the caregivers. They would just be more relaxed. They said when they were with the person, it would help. They'd be less agitated. And so she's, which I think is wonderful, has created a CD to help people as they transition.
Right. I've created a CD also, only my CD was actually reading excerpts from one of my boss's books. I work for Neil Donald Walsh, and one of his books was about death and dying. It was called Home with God in a Life That Never Ends. And I asked him if I could have permission to record excerpts from that book. And I have a wonderful musician named Stephen Pike who did the beautiful music in the background. My CD is called Forever with God. And so that's another option, because I think that soft music can really help a person to be able to leave gently, to leave their body gently. I think that's whether it's music that has wonderful messages in it, like these CDs, or just music. And it's a way to help guide them, I think, on their way.
What have you found in your research and talking to people? What do you believe to be the biggest fear around dying? Why do you think we fear it so much?
There are lots of different reasons. Some people have been told that if they did something in their lives that was wrong or bad, or if they didn't do something, that they were going to go to hell. It might be a religious view. And so they might be afraid of what they might encounter on the other side. Some people might think that they will cease to exist altogether, that the lights will go out and there'll be nothing left. And that can be scary. That can really be scary. And I think it's very misleading. That's why I really think that sometimes our religious views have hindered us more than helped us in some ways. And so that may be one reason for the fear. And of course we fear, I think probably all of us fear the way we will die. We don't want to think that we're going to die in such horrible pain or that we're going to die alone. We don't want to be alone at the end. So there are many different reasons that people do fear, but we can work through those fears if we really have an understanding.
Yeah, what I appreciate about the second half of the book is what I'd almost call like a workbook or a worksheet, because you, at the end of each chapter, ask the person questions, and so that way they can kind of think through and sift through and really kind of get to the core of what their beliefs are and where they're stuck and how they can move forward.
Right, because many of us are holding on to beliefs that we were taught as a child, and those things may not serve us anymore. We may have grown beyond those beliefs, but maybe didn't know it, and didn't know that it's time to let go of some of the fears and some of the attitudes that we grew up with. So, yeah, I wanted people to really look inside and see what is it that makes them afraid, and are they ready to release it.
Now, in addition to reading your book, have you recommended to people energy healing or different types of modalities maybe that can help them shift the fear of death?
I think there's so many wonderful modalities out. I do Reiki. Reiki is a form of energy work that can really help move the energy through one. I also am a certified hypnotherapist, and although I haven't practiced it much. I plan to do that in the near future, particularly past life regression. Whether you believe in past lives or not, it can really help a person if they have fears, if they have addictions. There are things that I think can make the death process less pleasant if we have not released them yet, and addictions would be one. And so with past life regression, you can go back through your own lifetime, this lifetime, or into other lifetimes previously and find out what is the root of my fear, my addiction, whatever it is that I'm holding on to. And once you can see where those things actually started, then you can release them, and then you can really do your healing work in this lifetime. So I really recommend those kinds of things. And of course, massage, any kind of body work, any kind of energy work is always going to help people to be able to move that energy through themselves and out so they can really let go.
Now, I'm kind of on the same page with you. I believe in past life regression. I believe we've lived more than one life. Have you found when working with people or talking with them, if there is a realization perhaps, like with Andraez, that this was his soul path, this was his purpose and his legacy, if they look at it from that view, are people open to that? Are they open to shifting to that? And has that made an impact?
Well, I don't have any clients at this point. I've been certified since 1996. But I've had a full-time job in the meantime. Now my job is going to be lightening up a little bit, so I'm going to now begin to do that as a practice. So I can't say I can speak from experience, but Brian Weiss is a wonderful, well-known hypnotherapist who does a lot of past life regressions, and what he has found has definitely found that people really do. Even if they don't believe that they live past lives, it doesn't really matter whether it's true or not. No one can say that it's true. We don't know that. But you can still make the connection as to where fears started. I also believe in, and this may be controversial, but my belief is that many people, especially if they have an addiction of any kind, be it alcohol, smoking, drugs, sugar, anything, oftentimes we have entities that are attached to us, and body work and other kinds of entity releasement work can help with that too. And once we release those beings, those energies from our field, our aura, then we can also do more deep healing work after that. So there are many ways to create a peaceful passing.
Can you talk a little bit about the Eastern view of death? Because most Eastern beliefs, I believe, are around reincarnation and death, and so they have a much different perspective.
Right, and that's probably why they don't see that death, what we call death, is really the end. They see it as a doorway, I think. They see it as a continuation day. They see it as if we're taking off a coat and we'll be putting on a new one soon. There are all different theories about that. And as I said, no one knows for sure. These are all theories and beliefs, but it makes so much sense to me. Many of the Eastern religions really, I think, help prepare themselves for their process of leaving the body. The Egyptian Book of the Dead and all those kinds of books, they have a whole process to lead a person through that, lead them up to that doorway and beyond. And our Western culture doesn't seem to have that as much. We've just been given a whole different mindset. But many people are combining the two. I think the Eastern religions are really becoming more popular here, and people, including myself, are being able to incorporate those beliefs along with our own traditional beliefs, because my background was Christian growing up. And now I guess I can say that I believe in the light of truth that shines through all religions. I believe all religions also have a lot of things that don't serve us, that perhaps had been misinterpreted. So I think we all have to find our own path, our own spiritual path.
I'd agree with you on that. Now, pardon me if I'm wrong. I'm getting old. I can't remember everything. I thought I remember you saying in your book, and I've been trying to flip through and find it. Have we changed in America? Did we used to be more accepting and embracing of death, but was there a cultural change around that?
There was, and I'm trying to remember that part of my book as well. It seemed as though people did not get as upset about death. And I want to say maybe back in the 1800s or even in the early 1900s. And then as technologies perhaps were designed that would help us to live longer, I don't know, people just started to react emotionally more, where they hadn't. They had taken death pretty much for granted before those times, because it was pretty much expected that if you had a lot of children, many of them would die young. And not that they were any less sad than we are now, but they just understood that this is the way it is, and they accepted it, and they had a ritual around it, and the children were part of that ritual of preparing for a person to leave this earth and to say goodbye. Nowadays, and perhaps it's partly because of our media, that things are just kind of in a different proportion, and people grieve much more emotionally and wailing, and I don't know whether that's a good thing or not a good thing. We certainly need to do our grieving process. That's an important part. I'm not saying that we should just nonchalantly accept death without having the grief process. We don't want to stifle that, but it's gotten a little out of control by thinking that because we have these technologies that can make a person live far longer than they would have otherwise lived, and in many cases far longer than they even want to live, then people have gotten a little out of control with that process.
When I was 21, I probably need to get it updated. I had a living will made, because when my grandfather died, by the time he died, I was a junior in high school. He had cancer throughout his entire body. And I just remember seeing him, and I was lucky he could go home and my grandmother's with him and spend the last days of his life with my grandmother and not in a hospital. But remembering a nurse coming in, or I remember before they moved him back home, being in the hospital and him saying, "Can you just move my feet?" I mean, it was just obvious he was in so much pain. So I'm like, I'm getting a living will. If I'm, I want control over that. If I had another friend, her mother, they accidentally tripped and unplugged her. She was hooked up to machines, and they just should have let her die. But, they plugged it back in, and it was just very excruciating for the family. So, what are your thoughts on living wills? Or, I look at something like, I should know this case. It's, what's the most famous case in the U.S., and they fought for years and years and years. And all I kept thinking was, she's gone. And, and it's not a judgment, like the parents are grieving. I completely get that. But to me, it just went beyond a point of sanity. Like it's, I don't know what it morphed into, but that wasn't her.
Right. I think you're probably talking about Terry Schiavo. That was the most famous case. And of course, her family, her parents and siblings wanted to keep her alive just in case. And her husband felt that it was time to disconnect. I believe that was the scenario there. And so she lived for many, many years just on a respirator. That's a really big topic and a really controversial one, because I've been, of course, reading about this 13-year-old girl. You're probably familiar with Jahai
Oh, yeah, in California.
Yes. And gosh, I've done just some research. I'm certainly no expert, but I've gone online, and I have seen several cases where one case I remember was a young man who 4 or 5 different doctors declared that he was brain dead, and yet he came out of it and he's perfectly healthy. There was another woman who was declared brain dead, and she woke up to find herself on an operating table, and she looked around and realized she was the one on the operating table.
Wow.
And they were getting ready to take her organs, because organ donation is a very big business, unfortunately. And from what I understand, and I only understand this from what I've seen online, but I think sometimes just because a doctor says you are brain dead, I don't know that we can really judge parents for wanting to hold on just to make sure. I saw so many things online, people commenting, especially about Jahai, about her mother wanting to keep her alive. Her mother apparently says that Jahai is moving around. She can actually lie on her side. She seems to sense when there's someone that comes in the room. She seems to be aware. And I think even people in a coma are aware when we're talking to them. So I don't think it's anyone's business to really say that her mother should pull the plug. And I don't think any of us can really know, unless we're in that situation, what we would do. But I see so many comments of people that are just really heartless, very, very lacking in compassion, let's say. The things that they say about how that she should just take her off the respirator and let her die. Well, we don't know that. There were several other cases I came across in my research of people who were considered brain dead, and there are some doctors who are really looking at that term brain dead and really wondering, can they really determine someone is dead? If the heart is still pumping, just because they say the brain doesn't have any activity, that doesn't necessarily mean that person is dead. That is still a living person. So I think it's really something that can only be determined with the family, and I don't think you can just say that everyone should, if they have a diagnosis of brain dead, that's it, they should pull the plug.
Yeah,
it's hard to know what we would do in that case. But when you love someone, obviously it's your own child, you're going to say, well, no, let's wait, let's find out, especially if she is moving around, and Jahai apparently is able to move. And of course there are doctors who say, that's just an involuntary movement. But the doctors are very quick to say, you need to donate the organs. And there are some doctors that are actually taking the organs before that person is actually dead.
Wow.
So it says online. Yeah.
That's awful.
Yeah,
I didn't know that. But I think, again, like not having, and hopefully I'll never be in that situation, I would hope I would trust my intuition. Like I would know, are they really gone? Or, because, I believe absolutely if you're in a coma, people can hear and sense even if they can't articulate it. But I think, again, if we have, as a culture and a society, have this huge fear of death and see it as something bad, then we'll fight or hold on perhaps when maybe a point has passed. I think of my grandmother. I had a grandmother who had Alzheimer's, and I was grateful when she finally died, because the disease kept progressing backwards. And for a long time, I would say to my mom, I'm like, she's halfway on the other side. It to me felt like she was maybe 90% on the other side, and just her body was almost a shell. She just wasn't there. I don't know how else to describe it. And so when she died, we were grateful, because it just, she was still physically fairly strong, but she had checked out.
Yeah, I often wonder about Alzheimer's, if they are really suffering or if it's we who suffer in watching them. I don't really know that for sure. But going back to the living will or advance directive, I think that is really important. However, another thing I found out as I researched my book is that if you happen to find yourself in a Catholic hospital, even if you have an advance directive or a living will, they may not honor it. If your family knows that you would not want to be kept alive by hydration and tube feeding, if you're in a Catholic hospital, they will do it anyway. And someone said that's not true. So I called the diocese up in Portland just to make sure, and they said, yes, absolutely, because the Catholic religion does believe that as long as you are alive, it is their duty to feed you and give you water.
Thank you for bringing that up. That's another excellent point, because I didn't know that, and I was just blown away by that, because I thought, your legal rights, you've done everything according to your state's laws, but you can be overruled. And so I think that's something else people. So what do you have any? Well, obviously in that situation, you would want to know prior to a hospital if it's Catholic owned. Is that the right way to look at it?
Yeah, I think so. A lot of people think, well, I'm not Catholic, so it wouldn't apply to me, but it would apply if you were in a Catholic hospital. So, yeah, you need to know who is the administrative body of that hospital, and maybe your doctor only goes to that hospital. Maybe you need to find a doctor that would go to a different hospital. I don't know, but I was shocked to find that out as well, and it's hard to believe that, all the precautions we might take around our own end times, and then someone else's belief system could actually undo what we've done.
So if Andraez had been at a Catholic hospital, he probably wouldn't have been allowed to die. Is that right? Would they have forced him to go through the surgery?
That's a good question. They, regardless of what hospital they tried to force him to. It was only because they got him out of the country in the nick of time that they escaped that, and also because the medical personnel made several mistakes along the way, and Gordy, his father, was documenting those things. So I think eventually they gave up in trying to make him go through with that. In fact, one more part of Andraez' story that I think is really important. At the end, he did end up in a hospital, and he was on oxygen. He reached up and took his own oxygen mask off, and when Gordy went over to put the mask back over his little boy's mouth, Andraez took his daddy's arm and said, "Daddy, turn off my lungs." And he repeated that. And as he was dying, his very last words were, "When the wind chimes chime." That's why I chose that as the title of the book. And when I asked Gordy what he thought Andraez meant by that statement, Gordy said, "Well, I think he's saying that when I hear wind chimes, know that he's near me or think of him." But I had a different take on that. And I'd like to share that if you don't mind.
Oh, absolutely. And thank you for bringing this up.
Yeah, you may be familiar with Daniel Brinkley, who wrote Saved by the Light and many other books. He is a best-selling author. And I think this was probably back in the 70s or so, he was struck by lightning. He was declared dead for 28 minutes. He was in a hospital on a gurney with a sheet over him. They were getting ready to take him downstairs to the morgue when someone saw a puff of breath under the sheet and realized that he had come back into his body. And Daniel's books are about his experience on the other side when he was clinically dead. And he always heard wind chimes. And I remembered him saying that in his books. So I called Danny and had a conversation with him. And he said that when we are leaving this dimension and traveling through that tunnel that people talk about, people who have had near-death experiences or death experiences, they go through a tunnel-like passage with a light at the end of it. He said when we go through that tunnel that our frequency is adapting to the frequency on the other side, and that we hear that. We hear it as music. He hears it as wind chimes, and he's actually gone through that more than once. I think he's had at least 2 near-death experiences like that. So he believes that Andraez was already entering that tunnel, and also that Andraez instinctively knew that what was holding him in his body was the breath. And so he had to remove his own oxygen mask so that he would be free of the breath, free of breathing, so that he could move into that tunnel and be on his way. And I think that was just such a beautiful part of his story. That's why I chose that title.
Oh, no, most definitely was. And wasn't there something interesting about the number? Didn't he die like on the 7th day? There was some number connection?
Right. Well, his father said 7 is a very spiritual number. And, of course, his name, Andraez, has 7 numbers. And it was the 7th, I forget, he was on the 7th floor of the hospital. There were a lot of 7s in there, and I don't remember how that went. But 7 rhymes with heaven.
Ah, that too. I just thought that was very interesting. But have you seen, maybe because you've done more research in this, that there are more people who have died and are coming back to share their near-death experiences? Because I wonder if that's part of a soul path to help increase the awareness globally and to help us be less afraid of death.
Well, that's a good thought. I know there are more people talking about it. I think it's always been happening. People have left their bodies in various cases, maybe in an accident or in an operation or something, and come back in. They didn't talk about it as much years ago because they didn't know. They didn't know what was happening, or they just put it out of their mind. But Daniel Brinkley actually was probably one of the first people who was able to talk about it. And of course, Dr. Raymond Moody was the first one who coined the phrase near-death experience, or NDE. And as he began to write his books, he began to find more and more people who had that experience. And they started sharing their experience with other people and realizing that there were a lot of commonalities there. So I think it's becoming, I think it's always been happening, but maybe it's just more in the forefront now. And maybe there are more now because we are moving through these times. I look at our generations as a bridge to a new way of being in life. And near-death experiences really show us that death is not something to be feared, and that death doesn't really happen, that we continue to live even after we leave these bodies. So I think it is a big thing happening now to help us to really open up to the new paradigm.
Can you talk briefly, you had asked one of the questions about soul contracts and people's beliefs around that. Can you first explain, for someone that might not know, what soul contracts are, and let's talk about that for a little bit?
Okay, that's something Carolyn Mace writes about a lot. And I think it goes back to the part of the book that I wrote as a soul plan. I believe, in my belief system, before we come into this life, we gather together with the loved ones that we have shared many lifetimes with. And we come up with a plan. We may have a contract with someone. We may have someone that we hurt in a past life, and so we have a contract that in this life, we're going to do something different that's going to kind of even that out. I don't believe in karma in the way that some people talk about karma, an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, but I do think that what we put out when we leave this life, we are able to evaluate the things that we did in this lifetime, and we see where we need to make amends perhaps, or do things differently, or grow in a different way. And so we come together, I believe, with our loved ones on the other side and make a plan to come back into this life. Sometimes, though, we have contracts that we shouldn't have made, and we need to release those contracts. I had a case like that once with someone that, let's say they took a lot of money from me. And I thought, well, maybe in a past life I had taken a lot of money from them somehow, and that's why this was happening. I went into a past life regression with a regressionist one time, and actually what came up was that in that lifetime, that person was my child, had been a sickly child, and I had said to that child, I will always take care of you. And that was a contract I made with that person. And in this lifetime, I have a different relationship with that person in this lifetime, but I found that I actually was trying to take care of that person more than I should have. So that's just one example. There are many examples, but we sometimes have contracts that we need to let go of.
Thank you, just for someone that might not be aware of that. But then again, that also gives you a nice different perspective. And again, maybe if you can see something in a new angle or new view, then it can lessen the pain or lessen whatever. I mean, I'm in terms of death and dying. If you're, again, if you go back to Andraez, who his soul contract was to for this, to bring this topic up, and so he's okay. Then you're like, okay, it's sad that he died, but you know what? Wow, all this good came out of it.
Right. I also think that it's really important as we come to the end of our lives that we be able to leave in a clear way. And that means having let go of our anger, our hatreds, our judgments, anything that we are holding on to, an emotion. We need to be able to release those. And that's why forgiveness work is really important all the way through life, but especially at the end of life. So if you come to the end of your life and you are in Andraez's case, they could have been very angry at the medical system for what happened. They could have been angry with God for what happened. But when you understand and you let go of those angers and those emotions, then you're more able to leave this planet in a clear way, in a gentle way.
I read a book. I don't know if you've read Radical Forgiveness.
I did, yes.
So that for me was really, I'd done a lot of work, and I wasn't able to forgive someone who had really harmed me. And I was like, ah. And then somehow the book, and my one friend teases me, because I'll be like, wait, I'm going to bring out my Radical Forgiveness worksheet. But it works for me when I'm able to switch it and look at it from a new perspective. But after I read that book, it was the most incredible moment, because I was able to forgive the person I just hadn't been able to, and I was really like, I don't know what to do. And so for me, it was just this amazing aha moment. But I also think you need to be, I don't want to say spiritually developed to a certain point. I think you need to be open to a certain point, or have understanding to a certain point, because if you don't and you just pick up the book, you might be like, wow, this is nuts. What are your thoughts?
Right. Well, and I think we also have to forgive ourselves a lot of time. I personally don't believe they're in good and bad, right and wrong, and all of that. I think it's all perspective. So what one person calls bad or wrong, another person at the level of development that they are, they feel that it was okay or right. So there's a lot of ways to forgive people. One thing that helps me is to imagine that person as a newborn baby, and to see in your mind's eye, see that person growing up, and see how that person was as a child, how he or she was treated as a child, especially if we are abused. There are so many people that have been abused by a relative or anyone, but if they can see that person, how they were treated as a child, you can come more to understand why they do the things that they do. I'm distracted because there's a cat climbing up my back. Excuse me.
Oh, that's okay. That's a good thing. I love that suggestion for a visualization. That's wonderful.
Yeah, and sometimes we have done things to other people that we know has hurt them in one way or another, hurt their feelings or something. So it's important to just understand we're all human. We're all on this path. We're doing the best we can. Sometimes we feel we need to forgive someone, or we need to ask forgiveness, and it's important to do that, especially if we're coming to near the end of our lives. That's when we really need clarity. We need completion. We need closure. So that's the time to let go of all those old animosities and judgments and bad feelings, and just to release it. And that's a wonderful book. I don't remember a whole lot about that book. It's been many years since I read that. But, even if you have to have someone you want to forgive and they're no longer living, or they're not in your life, you can just imagine that you're sitting across from them. You can tell them the things you need to say, and then you can say, I forgive you. It is possible. I know it doesn't seem possible for some people in some cases, but I don't think there is anything that is unforgivable. And I know that what I believe is God, there's nothing that would be unforgivable. So as human beings, we are part of that, which we call God. We can forgive. It's just a choice.
I know when I was finally able to forgive, I was like, dang, this takes a lot of energy not to forgive. I mean, you really realize. Yes. And, I had processed it. I had forgiven intellectually, but I hadn't forgiven emotionally, I would say, or from my heart. And so it was still there. But you just really realize, and it's like that great quote, not forgiving is like, giving poison to yourself. I mean, when you think you're keeping the other person on the hook, you're the one that's still on the hook.
Absolutely, and it really puts blocks in our life. Our own life energy doesn't flow as freely if we're holding on to that stagnant energy in our own field, because it lodges in our body too. When there's a lot of anger, we can relate that, especially the Eastern cultures relate that to the liver. Anger ends up in your liver, and you could end up with problems in that part of your body. If you hold on to something you haven't said to someone, it might end up in your throat, and you can end up with thyroid problems or whatever. There's all kinds of correlations that way between our emotions and different parts of our physical body. So if we want to be healthy, we really have to have healthy emotions, and we need to release all those negative emotions that we hold on to. So that's my belief anyway.
One of my favorite questions in your book, and your questions for to contemplate, what are your deepest fears in regard to living? I mean, we're talking about death and dying, but you asked that. Why did you ask that? I'd love to discuss that.
Why did I ask that? Well, people who are not afraid to live and who live their lives fully, I think they are more able to move to the end of their life and know that they are going to continue, and that they're not going to be afraid of the death process. I think that the people who really fear death oftentimes are afraid to live their life really fully. It's just, there's a correlation there. And so we look at those kinds of things.
Yeah, no, I think that that's really important, because a lot of times people aren't going to look at that.
If we live in fear, then we might be afraid to, for instance, move somewhere that we need to move, or take a new job, or leave a relationship that isn't working. And so we're letting fear control our lives. And if fear controls our lives, fear is probably going to control when we leave the life too.
I'd say for most of my life I was on autopilot. And then, I don't know, I've been thinking about this topic a lot lately. I don't know if it was a spiritual awakening I had, but I did when I lived in Los Angeles. I did a program called Clear Sight, and it was about digging through the layers and getting through stuff. And after I graduated, I had this realization. I was like, oh, okay, but how do I heal? How do I move forward? And then less than a year, I moved cross country here, not knowing anyone, and finally, I think, woke up and started to live.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love moving into new situations. I'm not afraid of change. In fact, I thrive on change. And that's probably kind of rare because most people, they get in a situation that they're comfortable with in their comfort zone, and they don't want to leave it. But I really love change, and being able to do that helps you to deal with those fears, and you feel so much freer. And when you feel free to live, you can feel free to move on into whatever is next for us after this life.
Yeah, absolutely. I used to be afraid of change. I was like a cat. But, it's true. I mean, death is the ultimate fear of the unknown. I mean, even if you have a belief system, you might be like, well, am I right? I haven't experienced it, so I'm kind of guessing here. So I believe as you get more accustomed to change, it can help ease your fears around death, or at least it did for me.
Right, and I think death is something that's been happening since the beginning of time. So it must be pretty natural. Must be the way it's supposed to be. We can't really not do it. We're all going to do it, so might as well meet it with ease.
I also appreciated your chapter. Let's talk a little bit about suicide, aid in dying, physician-assisted suicide, or why did you add that chapter, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that.
Okay. Well, actually, we don't like to use the term physician-assisted suicide. I know some people think of it that way, but I think there's a really big difference between suicide and aid in dying, or death with dignity is another way of saying that. Suicide is when a person has every capability of living and they simply choose not to. And I think it's something that requires a lot of our compassion. I know we judge it, but it's a desperate act, and we need to have compassion for those people who choose that route. I don't think it's an answer. I believe that whatever issues we have that would ever cause us to want to commit suicide, that those same issues will go with us and we'll still have to face them. And it's easier to face them when we're in the physical body and can do something about those issues. Death with dignity, or aid in dying, is something totally different, because that is a choice made by a person who can't choose to live. They are dying. In fact, to qualify even for this program, you have to have had at least two doctors say that you have less than 6 months to live. You have to be over a certain age. I think it's over 18 or 21, whatever the legal age is in your state. You have to be in a state that has passed the law, and you have to be psychologically sound. There are many stipulations in there. It's not that anyone can do this, but certain people have a disease that they know could be extremely painful at the end, where the pain cannot be alleviated. Now, most people, if they have hospice care, they are going to be able to have their pain alleviated with just hospice care and the things that they can do. But if you're in so much fear that you could be in a lot of pain, it might be a comfort to have a prescription from a doctor that you could take if you have to at the very end. And it's very controversial. I understand that, but we do this to our pets, of course. We don't want to see them suffer, and so we put them to sleep. Well, it's similar to that. There are 5 states that have passed a law where it is legal for a doctor, if the doctor chooses to go along with this, for the doctor to write that prescription. Many people get the prescription and never use it, but it eases their mind to know that they have that prescription there if it gets so bad that they can't stand it at the end. Oregon was the first state to pass the law. Washington was the second state. Vermont came on board just last year. Montana, another one. And then just recently, just a couple months ago, New Mexico, I believe, was the 5th one to pass the law. And when I say the law, that simply means that if a doctor chooses to help his patient this way, he will not have to lose his license or go to jail. Without that law, that's a possibility. And I think it's a compassionate way. It's not that we are committing suicide. It's there are certain cases, perhaps ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease might be one, where you know that at the end it might be really horrible. And it's easy for someone else to say that you really should suffer, that's God's way or something. Some people believe that, but we need the choice. We need to have the choice for, just as we should have the choice as how we live our life, we should be able to choose how we want to die.
Yeah, I think that's so important. When my Sybil, who was like a second mother to me, died in January, and she was very open. She's like, I know I'm dying, and she said the only thing she said, she was on morphine, and then when I last saw her, she had an oxygen tank that she had to use. She had never smoked but got lung cancer, and so what she said to me, she said, the only thing is I just want to go when the pain's too much. She said, I just don't want to. That's my only thing. She said, most stuff I can handle, but just if there comes a point, then I'm ready. Like, I want to go. I don't want to, try to live I'm done.
Of course, yes. And, in most cases, like I said, hospice can help with morphine, and things will just be very gentle. But there are those cases, and just for ease of mind to know that you have that there. For some people, that's helpful. I like to recommend a website, choicesandcompassion.org. That's the organization that is actually helping the different states, and many different states are wanting to pass these laws as well. They haven't got it through yet, but Choices and Compassion works with them. It's to me, it's the most compassionate thing we can do for people, is to allow them that choice. If they want to die without pain, they should have that right.
Talk about, I love what your idea of a good death is, and maybe you can share maybe if there's one story in your book that you thought was really wonderful, or something you're planning on doing, or know someone, and why that's important.
Well, I had many stories in the second part of the book. One was my grandmother when she was in a nursing home towards the end of her life, and she had a vision. And she was not an overly religious person, but my mom went to see her one day in the nursing home, and my grandmother said, "Guess who came to see me this morning?" And my mom figured it must be the minister. Who else would come at that time? And my grandmother said, "No, it was Jesus." She saw a being of light at the end of her bed, and he was just standing there. I think he was beckoning her as if to follow him. Now, because she was Christian, she interpreted that as Jesus. Someone else might interpret it as an angel or as an ancestor or anything else, but it gave her comfort. I think it really helped her to really face her last days, knowing that everything was fine. She was going to be going to a good place. I had several other cases in the book of visions, and I also had a friend whose husband wanted to have a celebration of life while he was still alive. And so they had a big party, and he had like 100 people there, and he enjoyed it. He died, I think it was the very next day is when he died. So there can be good ways to die. We don't have to think of it as a horrible thing. We don't have to watch, if we watch TV all the time or read the news, we're going to think it's pretty bad. But if you focus on more uplifting scenarios of how people can come to the end of their lives, and just know that all you're going to do is leave your body, and you're going to be every bit as alive as you were moments before. To me, that's a good death.
Absolutely, and I like that idea. I want to have a nice big party, a blowout. I'm going to eat everything, all the junk food that I want. I'm going to go out with a bang. So, Donna, please tell people your website and how they can get the book, and if you have anything, upcoming events that you'd like to share.
My website is just DonnaCorso.com. Donna, D-O-N-N-A. Corso is C-O-R-S-O.com. You can order the book from there, and there's also a little YouTube on there about Andraez and his process, and a little more background. And also my CDs are available on there. As I said, Forever with God. You can actually download that. I don't have any upcoming events. I'm going to be in Peru for most of June at Machu Picchu, and who knows what I'll do after that. I will be starting a practice in hypnotherapy when I come back from there, so I'll be doing that in the future. And I don't know, I live in the moment, so we'll see.
Outstanding. Well, everyone can find out information at DonnaCorso.com, and I want to thank you, Donna, for joining us today. It's a great book, and hopefully we'll get more of Andraez's story out there, as well as starting a conversation around death and dying.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie, for having me on. It's been fun.
All right, everyone. Thanks for watching, and get out there and reawaken your brilliance, and we'll see you next week. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. Our weekly lineup of call-in programs includes Computers 2K Now with Amnon Nissan, Health In with Debbie Bruck, Breaking Free with Marilyn Shannon, Lessons of Vietnam with NCVVI members, The Tanya Love Show, Reawaken Your Brilliance with Julie Seibert, and if you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it at www.nissancommunications.com. Sponsored by Atomus.com, makers of quality video recorders and converters for professionals. That vidblasterguy.com, CarolinaApparel.com, and DeltaForce.net.